Bulavanaka. Hello and welcome to this talk, which is Vanua in the Anthropocene, Fijian Ontologies and Climate Change. My name is Maebh, and I'm from the School of Language, Arts and Media at the University of the South Pacific. The importance of the sea in Pacific epistemologies and discursive structures requires little introduction, as the ocean has long been, as Apeli Hawafa puts it, the Pacific's most powerful metaphor. The sea, for many Pacific Island peoples, is not an empty space which girds place, but a vital, dynamic aspect of identity and home. The waters of the Pacific have facilitated a shift from an imposed rhetoric of vulnerability, lack, and smallness to grandeur, bounty, exploration, and prowess. But how is the ocean, as a discursive trope, a medium for identity formation, a vehicle for distinct epistemologies, and a channel for regional pride, affected by climate change? How does anthropogenic sea level rise impact upon these empowering narratives? How do we negotiate the physical changes being wrought to the ocean when, as H.E. Emmanuel Mori, then President of the Federated States of Micronesia, said to the UN General Assembly, I quote, "Today's disregard for our planet is slowly making the ocean, that has always nurtured us, become the very instrument of our destruction." End quote. I would like to explore this disconnect by focusing on the Fijian word Vanua, which, and there are many comparable terms in Oceania, which names the interrelation of community and environs, and denotes an intimate connection with nature, in which nature is not reified but part of the self. So this paper looks first at the meanings and implications of Vanua, tracing the potential and the liquid relations between part and whole that it performs. It then examines the ways in which Vanua's connections between humans and nature render climate change-induced sea level rise not simply a loss of ancestral home and livelihood, but an attack on the self. While the majority of analysed material stems from published works, this research is supplemented by Talanoa sessions, which are discussion sessions, held in 4 villages between 2014 and 2015, in Daku and Nananu in Tailevu province in Viti Levu, and in Vuni Savi and Vuni Dongoloa in Thakandrove province in Vanua Levu. And this piece is part of a wider project on Fijian narratives of sea level rise, with project members from the University of the South Pacific and from Fiji National University. The term Vanua can be translated simply as land, place, or community, but its most resonant figural use names a connection and interdependence between people and nature, and between people and place, an interconnection that invests meaning and identity. People are figured as the lewa ni Vanua, flesh or members of the land, or the souls of the physical environment. And as such, the ties of the Vanua render people, I quote, the human manifestation of the physical environment. In the Vanua, the cultural, social, environmental, ecological, spiritual, and physical are all interlinked, with the result that, as Nambombo Mbamba writes, when one talks of the environment, land, waterways, ocean, trees, and forests, Fijians often discuss these interchangeably with people's kinship relations, values, spirits, life after death, and all knowledge about life itself. Vanua also includes those who have gone before, and a vital part of the link it enables is with the ancestors, who remain an almost tangible part of the community. Thus, Vanua is a cord that interweaves people to the land, to each other, to their past and to their future, and intersecting across time and space. Vanua can be understood ontologically as a form of being in relation, a connection with place that prioritizes coexistence and relationality rather than possession or commodification. Thus, people and their physical environment are one, and their mana or power stems from this connection. So Vanua names, in this sense, a deeply situated, emplaced body politic, as the land is part of the self, and self is part of the land. The unity that Vanua describes does not undo hierarchies, and it's in its underpinning and interruption of dialectical relations that the importance of the term can be felt. Now, this can be most clearly exemplified in Vanua's treatment of ground, as opposed to and incorporating the sea. So in Capel's Fijian dictionary, Vanua is described as land, region, place, or spot, with the political connotations of confederation or land under a strong chief, and the ability to mean home. The only mention of water or ocean-related objects is the obsolete Wanga Vanua, which he translates as a very large canoe. Tuere argues that Vanua means living in community, and for him community means, I quote, life lived close to the soil. For him, the three geographical spheres of Vanua are the Yavu, which is the house site, Ngele ni Tete, which is arable land, and the Vekau, which is forest. In Ravuvu's The Fijian Ethos, the physical Vanua is described as, again this is a quotation, the land area with which a person or a group is identified, together with its flora, fauna, and other natural constituents. The ground of Vanua is the place in which ancestors are buried, and to which newborns are conjoined through the burying of the umbilical cord. In our Talanoa sessions, when villagers were asked what Vanua meant, they usually answered first in relation to cultural practices and connections with the land, and only included the community's ngoli-ngoli, which is the fishing area, in the lakes and rivers and seas, when they were asked directly about it. But, while written accounts of Vanua tend to privilege the relation between people and dry land, Vanua is not dominated by the earthly. For example, despite some caveats, Ravuvu's Vaka Itauke describes Vanua as consisting of, I quote, all the ngele, soil or dry land, and wai, which is water, which the members of a particular tribe have claimed. More recent accounts have tended to stress the inclusion of water, with Dudgeon and Burkes describing Vanua as, again this is a quotation, a named area of land and sea, seen as an integrated whole with its human occupants. And Yone Davula Olango argues that Vanua covers the land, sea, and the atmospheres, which are all interconnected. The link forged with the Vanua at birth can be with the waters rather than the earth, as a child's umbilical cord may be cast into the ocean, and the feces of a child might be thrown into the sea, river, or lake, with the fish from that site later ritually presented to the child's maternal grandparents. Inasmuch as the land is given names, so too is the reef and the nearby sea, with that naming denoting connection. The tambua, which is the whale's tooth, is the paramount chiefly symbol, and the highest mark of respect. So the borders of place and self do not end at the shoreline, but continue out into the water, which embeds the nearby sea with all its bounty and threats in the sense of home and self. So, we find a complex movement and overdetermination within the term Vanua, as it designates both dry earth, which is opposed to the sea, and place, which includes the sea. Land and sea are presented as opposites, and yet they're not, as they seep into one another on the gentle reef-protected shorelines. Vanua thus names one side of the earth-water binary, registering difference, while showing the dialectic to be conjoined. Yet it also names the synthesis of the dialectic, in that Vanua, as a principle of relationship between all aspects of community, includes earth and water and people. So it thus signifies both a shifting part of the whole and the whole itself, operating simultaneously on two different conceptual levels, section and totality. As Vanua names both the community and the attachment between people and place, it denotes reciprocal relations, as place belongs to the people and people to the place, as well as shifting hierarchies, as place and ancestors are sometimes privileged over people, and people are sometimes privileged over place and ancestors. So Vanua thus signifies interconnectivity, while also being a dynamic element within the connections. The multiplicity of its meanings and positions acts as a point of resistance to stable binaries and hierarchical relations, so that it fundamentally operates as an aquatic, fluid concept that represents a dynamic, shifting series of ontological relations. And so while Vanua gives conceptual and semantic privilege to the land, it's an entirely liquid functioning. So we can understand Vanua as a permanently dynamic metonymy of ontology as emplacement. In a village setting where hierarchy is deeply embedded, the term that links does so absolutely holistically, in every direction. Vanua is the flexibility and fluidity of the relation that enables opposites, and the dissolution or synthesis of opposites, to occur without everything falling apart. So it's the structure of cohesion that enables logical and structural interruptions of relations, binaries, and dualisms to occur without the destruction of all conjunctions. It does not merely name relation, but performs the possibility of relationality across time and space in a dynamic, changing world. So Vanua is not a metaphor. It's a shifting, fluid metonymy of interrelations. So how then is Vanua under threat? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's fifth assessment report predicts that sea level rise will be 0.5 to 0.6 of a metre by the year 2100, while Patrick Nunn has argued that by 2100 a sea level rise of 1.2 metres can be considered realistic in Fiji. This is a real fear for villages, as in Daku the tide comes over the land almost every week, and in Nananu the seawall that was built in the 1970s now has waves broaching it. In Vuni Savi Savi, the salination of the land and the encroachment of the sea was even more obvious. As one of the older women said, and I quote, "We are in great fear, because all the big trees along the beach have gone, been washed away by the waves." End quote. The waves are threatening the graveyard too, and the ancestral sacred ground. Some families have already moved to land higher up, and they say that this has caused a sense that the bonds that draw them together are loosening. In Vuni Dongoloa, coastal erosion and flooding has made remaining untenable, and in 2014 they became the first village in Fiji to relocate due to climate change. They gave their new village the private name of Canaan, the Promised Land, to signify that they were like the Israelites moving out of Egypt. The ontological relation of Vanua and the incorporation of the ocean into Pacific identities is, of course, not a taming of the waters, as interconnectedness does not mean domination. A life in relation is not easy harmony, and should most definitely not be thought to feed into damagingly romantic, reductionist, or inaccurate narratives of pre-modern life. But anthropogenic climate change is altering weather patterns, jeopardizing food security, increasing extreme storms like Cyclone Winston, which caused severe destruction across Fiji in February, and leading to the rising of the seas in ways that makes, for many communities, an existence of relation increasingly difficult. The sea, that which provided a discursive structure through which to resist the rhetoric of vulnerability, is rendering islanders vulnerable, because the sea, as a source of food, identity, pride, and empowerment, is being contaminated and made monstrous by the excessive consumption of other nations. In a period in which nature is being thought retrograde, in the Anthropocene, the sea, the Vanua, is turned against itself, and reduced from a complex dialectic to a threat. The scale effects of climate change mean that small private actions in the home can have large public effects in other countries, and wealthier nations no longer need to journey to the global south to take resources or change socioeconomic structures. In the case of climate change-induced sea level rise, we witness remotely accessed trespass and vandalism, as the sea, made different, higher, warmer, more unpredictable, by the actions of others, becomes a vehicle through which these others can intrude upon, damage, and destroy the Vanua. The ocean, as an enabling metaphor of regional identity, is being drowned by the non-figurative onslaught of the waves, an inundation caused by the consumption and pollution of the global north. The trauma this causes, with its resultant questioning of identity and enforced privileging of the land, can be found in Moana, The Rising of the Sea, written by the Ratuman playwright Vilsoni Herenico, in which the deep, beautiful, but dangerous sea is no longer a narrative of regional strength and identity, but a perilous threat that will engulf, and I quote, "How does it feel to be forced by the rising sea to abandon everything you hold dear and flee to another country to live among strangers? I would rather die here. Without this piece of land that defines who I am nothing. Is that what you would say? And if you should choose to flee, how will you fare? Can you live with the knowledge that you have abandoned the bones of your ancestors?" End quote. In this passage, the seas no longer provide a discourse of identity, and instead the land becomes that which defines. The rising sea erodes the complexity of the dialectical relation and of identity, as these waves are Vanua possessed, made other by the distant actions of developed countries, post-natural, hybridized water that is remotely operated, and turns on the self and the land, forcing rifts in the physical and ontological Vanua. As Selina Leem, a young woman from the Marshall Islands, said in an interview on sea level rise, I quote, "The waves went over the seawall and crashed into my grandparents' grave. That was the first time I felt the wave insulted me, really demeaned me, by just washing over my grandparents' graves and bringing all the rubbish that the ocean has." Similarly, in Kathy Jetnil-Kitchener's spoken word poem Dear Mate Filipinum, which she delivered at the 2014 United Nations Climate Summit, she speaks of the lagoon in the Marshall Islands being made to threaten.
That lucid, sleepy lagoon lounging against the sunrise. Men say that one day, that lagoon will devour you. They say it will gnaw at the shoreline, chew at the roots of your breadfruit trees, gulp down rows of your seawalls, and crunch through your island's shattered bones.
The rising of the sea effectively transmits to Vanua a communicable autoimmune disease. An autoimmune illness is one in which the body's immune system launches a destructive reaction against the body's own tissues, as it fails to distinguish between self and other, non-threat and threat. In a Vanua ontology of being in relation, when the sea rises, breaks over the sea walls, salinates the land and erodes foundations, we see part of the self attacking the self. Vanua as land is damaged by Vanua as sea. A Vanua made ill, possessed and contaminated by the actions of the global north. The rising of the sea is not caused by the community Vanua. Instead, the Vanua is being made allergic to itself as a result of actions of other nations and people. This should not be thought to reduce the villagers to passivity, nor imply that they are isolated and excluded from global discourse. But there is little question that it is larger states that are causing the sea to flood the land, countries which then reflect on Fiji's vulnerability and intervene with aid packages and foreign experts. By associating the islands of the Pacific with discourses of smallness, insularity, backwardness, fragility and vulnerability, dependence on westernized aid programs is fostered. There is an insidious understanding that the vulnerability of the islands pre-existed climate change, and as such removes blame from those who have created the situation of environmental threat, as it suggests that those who live in places deemed risky and isolated do so of their own choice and volition. In the case of anthropogenic sea level rise, we see not only the physical incursion of the waters and the resultant effects on home and food security that this has on the Vanua, but also the interruption of a discourse that has been extremely important for Fiji and wider Oceania. The dangers are both abstract and concrete. Can the aqueous movement of the being in relation of Vanua remain so when the waters become removed from a sense of self and connection, or become embedded as a threatening part of the self, a connection that menaces and damages? We've understood the shifting relations of opposites, parts and whole to enable fluid connections within the community. Can a culture of interrelation function in the same way when part of it is so radically altered? Will the change in the physical places of Vanua lead to a destabilizing of community relations to each other and to their environs? Can the centre, can Vanua, hold against the waves? We hope so, but we are deeply concerned. Vanaka Vakalevu, thank you very much for listening.